And let's pray together. God, now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. Probably no passage in the entire book of Acts comes under more historical scrutiny than the one that we have in front of us today. And I'm going to acknowledge those as we get to them, but largely the questions that arise about certain things are usually by those that are more inclined towards not believing what the text has to say anyway. But from the standpoint of the biblical text itself, Luke goes to great pains to tell us that he did his research. He paid attention to what was going on, and I don't think there's any very convincing reason to doubt the historicity of what it is that goes on. But one of the issues that people will raise, for example, is about from a procedural standpoint. Whenever Claudius gathers the Sanhedrin in the text that we just read, there are questions about, well, is this official? Is it unofficial? Is this something Claudius even would have done? And is he right to speak first before he's spoken to, and so on and so forth? And so the people begin to question, did this stuff really, really happen? Well, I don't think there's any need to doubt it, and I would say that if we accept Luke's report at face value, if we assume that he has done his homework, he's paid attention, and he's written down things as they happen, the significance of this so-called trial then will be, I think, rather apparent. The significance of it is Paul is never going to get a fair hearing before an unbelieving audience. He's just not going to. Luke is going to great pains to show Paul's innocence, and that's going to continue, and they've already broke out twice. They're going to do it again in this text in anger at what Paul's claiming. And so if he hopes to get a fair hearing for why he's on trial, it's simply never going to happen in front of a Jewish audience. And so the events of this chapter is going to get him one giant step closer to Rome, and that's going to happen with the Lord's encouragement. And I think that if you look at the way the text is laid out, that verse 11 is very important because it's pretty much near the middle of the chapter. And it's the words of Jesus to Paul, to take courage. As you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. And I think this is where we find incredible application for ourselves this morning. And of course, we'll come back to that at the end. But as we unfold this text, you can see from your outline that I've divided it into two sections for us. One is just him before the Sanhedrin, because we have to ask a lot of questions about this passage that we just read. And then as we get to verse 12 through the end of the chapter, we'll paint with a little bit broader strokes there, but we'll see how he's rescued once again and then transferred to Caesarea, where the next phase of his trial is going to take place, before we come back and make this, I think, very specific application. So let's begin at the very last verse of chapter 22, verse 30. We read that on the next day, after Paul had escaped flogging, Claudius wants to know the real reason why he's being accused by the Jews. So he unbound him. He commanded the chief priests and all the council, all the Sanhedrin, to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. We've got to be a little bit generous to Claudius here, because we have to think about what all he's gone through. This is all he knows. He knows that he has a Roman citizen in his custody, and this citizen is being accused by this Jewish mob of a very serious offense. But what are they even accusing him of? He has no idea, no clue. He wants to get to the bottom of it, and so him calling this council together, while some, again, would argue that this is not likely a thing that he would do, I think it makes perfect sense, because what Claudius has to determine, first of all, is Paul guilty or is he innocent? And he can't make a call based on that if he still doesn't know what he's being accused of. If it turns out that Paul is innocent, he's going to have to let him go, but he's going to need some kind of explanation for why he held him in custody. And if Paul is guilty, he's got to ship him down the line for his hearing at the next level. But if he's going to send him to court, what's he going to tell him? Why is he there? You arrested him, you put him on trial, but what's he guilty of? He's got to know something. So he calls this meeting together because he thinks that if he pulls a subset out of this mob, this council, maybe they'll be a little bit more even-headed. And it turns out that they're not. And we see it right away because there's a confrontation with Ananias. And let's just be clear, this is not the same Ananias that helped out Paul when he first became a believer. It's the high priest at that time. Paul looks intently at the council and he says, "Brothers, I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day, and the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth." Why would he do this? I mean, you think about he's sitting there in front of Claudius, he's sitting there in front of these Roman guards, they're trying to stop the riot. What would give him the chutzpah to smack somebody in the face? Why would he do it? Well, people give a lot of guesses. One is that Paul spoke before he was spoken to, and that doesn't seem to warrant striking somebody in the face. I don't think it makes much sense. Some people think that Ananias is actually very honorable here because he's lived a long time and he knows that nobody can claim to have a truly clear conscience. Anybody here willing to say you've never done anything wrong? Yeah. And he just thinks that Paul is lying and he deserves to be punched in the face. But can you imagine how our society would break down if that was a rule? Every time you caught somebody in a lie, you were allowed to punch them in the mouth. Sometimes I want to do that, but we can't do that. And I don't think that's what happened. Some people think that he did it because he just wanted Paul to plead guilty. If he'd just do that, this whole thing would go away. And he's just exasperated that Paul was maintaining his innocence. But, there again, I don't think that makes any sense. That he's just getting frustrated with Paul. And so most likely, I think this is why he ordered him to be struck, because Paul has started his defense. Back in chapter 22, what was the way he began talking about his own innocence? He starts out by talking about his Jewishness. The fact that he was born that way, he was trained in Judaism, and that he was still practicing, in a manner of speaking, Judaism. He just understood what its right conclusion was, and that was to follow Christ. And so when Paul says here, "I've lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day," what Ananias hears Paul saying is that being a good Christian does not contradict being a good Jew. And Ananias couldn't stand that. Because if Paul is right, that means he, as the high priest, is in sin for not believing in Jesus. Well, he is in sin for not believing in Jesus, but he's not ready to admit that. So he thought it was arrogant. He thought it was blasphemous, and he ordered him to be struck. Well, Paul responds very sharply. "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall." He pulls this image from the book of Ezekiel where there's a wall that's broken, and instead of fixing it, they think that if they just paint it white, nobody will notice. Yeah, that works, doesn't it? So he calls him a whitewashed wall. "You're not hiding anything. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck?" Not only that, when he's reviled, he goes on to say that he didn't even know this was the high priest. "For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." So how can Paul respond in this way? And how could he not know that this was the high priest? Well, regarding his response, we can't rule out the fact that maybe he just lost his temper. Jesus is perfect. Paul's not. He's the chief of sinners, he tells Timothy in his first letter to him. So maybe he just lost his temper, but it's also possible that God was using this as prophecy. See, we know a little bit about Ananias after this particular scene, and come to find out, he wasn't very well regarded as a high priest. And in fact, later on in life, some people began to suspect that he was a co-conspirator with the Roman authorities. And so little by little, we know that Jewish sentiment was building up and they were ready for a resistance, which eventually began in 66 AD. But as you got closer and closer to that year, some people were starting to cause a little bit of problems for the Romans. And because they suspected Ananias was working with them, a group of them found him and they bludgeoned him to death. So it turns out what Paul's saying here is actually not wrong. The Lord may have been using that as a prophetic voice. We just simply don't know. But I think the bigger question is, how could he not know that this was the high priest? Well, once again, we have a lot of people here saying there's no way Paul could not have known who the high priest was. So let's bring out the guesses. Why didn't he know? Well, some people suggest that this was an unofficial meeting and therefore Ananias was not robed, nor was he presiding. But here's why I think that's ridiculous. Imagine that you came to church this morning and I was wearing sweatpants and a hoodie. You'd still know who I was, right? Yeah. I don't think the argument that Ananias was in his street clothes is convincing to why Paul didn't know who he was. So some people say, well, there probably were a whole lot of voices shouting and somebody shouted, "Strike him on the mouth," and Paul simply didn't know which was the one that said that. I think that stands to reason. Some people will say, well, we know Paul had poor eyesight, but we don't know that. They base that on a couple of passages, neither of which I think prove he had poor eyesight. And another suggestion that goes all the way back to the 5th century in the church is that basically Paul was being sarcastic. And what he's saying is, I didn't realize somebody like you could be high priest. So what he was saying is, in verse 5, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. It would be something like this. I didn't know that he was the high priest, which is his way of saying, I recognize nothing priestly in this man whatsoever. Now I think it was number 4. I think Paul's being sarcastic. I didn't recognize that someone like you could behave that way. And possibly a little bit of number 2, that he couldn't discern from the voices. It's really hard to say. But here's what I do find interesting in the text. What is their reply to Paul? They don't say a word. This is why I think he's being sarcastic. I think because when Paul says this, they realize that, you know what, he's right. Somebody in this position should not behave that way. It's certainly not acceptable. So Paul, remember, is doing this rather impromptu. He hasn't had a whole lot of time to think. Yes, he's been kept in custody overnight, but he does change his strategy at this point. In verse 6, it's almost like something clicks in his brain and he realizes, wait a minute. This Sanhedrin is made up of 2 different groups. It's made up of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and we know that both of them were there. And Luke tells us just a little bit about them in verse 8. Now, this is not the totality of what the Sadducees were about, nor the Pharisees, but he says that the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And the truth is, it's on these very points that the knives are going to come out, and I think rightly so. You know, once in a while, you'll hear people, sometimes in the context of the church, to say things like, well, doctrine's not worth fighting over. And usually when people say that, it's one of 2 things. One of them is they've been parts of churches where people did fight over doctrine and they were splitting hairs and fighting over the minutia, and it really did lead to some heartache when it didn't need to do that. And churches split and they divided over things that were rather inconsequential in the final analysis. But other times when people say that we don't need to fight over doctrine, it's typically because they think doctrine is disposable. It simply doesn't matter. So, for example, several years ago, there was one rather famous pseudo-pastor who used this analogy in his church. He said, you know, doctrine is kind of like the springs on a trampoline. When you get on a trampoline, what's the goal? You want to get airborne, right? Well, can some of the springs fall off and it still get you up in the air? Yes, it can. And therefore, you can do away with certain doctrines and still be a Christian. And if that man doesn't repent, he's going to find out what hell is like personally. That's not true. Some things are very much worth fighting for. And what happens here in this particular text is Paul is able to pinpoint a specific doctrine that is of the utmost importance, and he is going to set these groups against one another because he knows that this is a big, big deal. But it does raise one question for us. Is it right for Paul to do this? Is it an honorable thing for him to make these 2 groups fight with each other just to get himself out of trouble? Well, I'll have to say, I don't think that he's doing this just to get himself out of trouble. I don't think his motives are unworthy. He's going to say in a couple of chapters, he's not even trying to escape death. He's okay if that's what comes to him, provided that he deserves it. So I don't think he has unworthy motives, and he's definitely not lying. So what exactly is he doing? Well, what Paul is claiming here, and I think that we should agree with this, is that a belief in the resurrection, specifically of Jesus Christ, is fundamental to the Christian faith. And we cannot deny the resurrection and still be a Christian. And so when he says here that I'm, with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead, that I am on trial, he is a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. He agrees with them on this point. I think he's telling the truth. Because simply put, here's what he's saying. If the resurrection is a hypothetical possibility, let's just say right now it's a hypothetical possibility, and we come to the conclusion that yes, it is, then why can't it apply to Jesus? What is it that makes it true that Jesus could not be resurrected, but other people can? That doesn't make any sense. And so if hypothetically the resurrection is true, then it can certainly apply to Jesus. And if hypothetically the resurrection is not true, then Christianity is an outright lie. And so when Paul says is, I'm on trial for this particular reason, because he knows that if he were just to give up this particular claim, all of these charges would go away. The Pharisees would be a little frustrated with him because he's denying the possibility. The Sadducees would love it. But either way, the charges go away. But we know that what Paul's calling is specifically is to testify to the truth of Jesus. Not so much to defend himself, not so much to watch his own backside, but to testify to the truth of Jesus Christ. So he is making a claim here that he is siding with the Pharisaic view regarding resurrection, and he is condemning the Sadduceic view. What he is saying here is that the Sadducees need a fundamental change in their thinking, or salvation will stay so far away from them. Because they're denying a very important part of doctrine, namely the resurrection, but also by denying angels and spirits, what they're doing is they're denying certain metaphysical realities that the Bible affirms from the very first words to the very last words of it in the New Testament. The Bible affirms all of these things, and the Sadducees have decided that they understand reality better than what the scriptures say. And I think that when Paul is suggesting here that they need a fundamental change in their thinking for salvation to come to them, he's echoing the very same sentiment that Jesus expresses towards them in Matthew 22:29. He says that they know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. Even the words that they read in the biblical text, they don't understand what they really mean. And the ones that they do read, they don't believe that they're true because they just don't believe that God is powerful enough to make it happen. So, is Paul really on trial for his claim about the resurrection? Well, what do they accuse him of? They accused him of speaking against the people, they accused him of speaking against the law, and they accused him of speaking against the temple. But what is Paul actually proclaiming? He's proclaiming the fulfillment of the law. He's proclaiming who the true temple is, and he's proclaiming who the true people of God are. And why is he able to say this? Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the truth is, if he were to give up his belief in the resurrection, they have no problem with him. All this goes away. That may not be the exact charge that they bring against him when they gather him in the temple and what they tell Claudius, but he sees through to the very core of the issue. If he just simply gives up the belief in the resurrection, all this goes away, and he won't do it. He shouldn't do it, and neither should we. So he states this truth. I'm on trial because of my belief in the hope of the resurrection of the dead. He sides with the Pharisees on the possibility, and then he affirms specifically that this resurrection happened with Jesus. And what he's arguing is if you would just see this, if you would just believe this, you would understand that I'm innocent in this entire matter. Because yes, if Paul denies the resurrection, the charges go away, but what happens if the entire Sanhedrin suddenly believes like Paul does? What happens to the charges? Well, they go away too. And what he's arguing is he doesn't want the charges to go away because he denies something fundamental to the faith. He wants the charges to go away because the very people that are accusing him, he wants to see them saved by the blood of Jesus Christ as well. I think that what he's doing here is not necessarily trying to cause a fight. I think what he's doing here is he's trying to work for the salvation of his enemies. That's a difficult thing, but I think he is. And of course, a fight breaks out in verse 9. But we read that some of the scribes of the Pharisees, they stood up and contended sharply, saying, we find nothing wrong in this man. And I want you to notice it's only some of them, not all of them. So we've got a very small portion, percentage-wise, maybe as low as about 25% of them, maybe best case scenario, 25% of them agree that Paul is actually innocent. But what if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And so this dissension eventually becomes violent. People begin to fight. So Claudius, he's just afraid Paul's going to be torn to pieces. So he commands him, go down, take him, bring him into the barracks. Let's keep him safe. And Claudius, at this point, this is the last time he's going to talk to this Jewish contingency, and he still does not find anything guilty in Paul. So Paul goes into custody, and we don't know what time of day necessarily this happened, but he sits there for a while, and then suddenly at night, he gets this encouragement from Jesus. And I just want you to think about what we've seen. Think about all the violence that Paul has seen over the last 2 days. He's in the temple. trying to do the right thing, trying to prove to people that he's not there to stir up trouble, and all of a sudden he gets jumped by a mob, and they start to beat him physically. And if it had not been for Claudius and the soldiers pulling him away, they would have ripped his head off. He would have been dead. But he's saved, and then he stands up and he defends himself in front of his accusers, and they try to get him a second time. Then, when he's rescued from them the second time, he's stretched out because he's about to be beaten by whips, and then that stops because they discover he's a Roman citizen. He goes before his accusers for a third time, and he tells them the truth once more, and then what happens? It gets violent, and they're ready to tear him apart for a third time in just 2 days. I want you to think about how discouraging it would be if you were in that position. Nothing but violence, so intense over the course of 2 days, and you just have to wonder if maybe Paul began to wonder if he would ever leave Jerusalem, if he'd ever make it to Rome. Because think with me for a second, what happens if Claudius comes in and says to Paul, "You're free to go"? What would you say? I ain't going out there. I know what's going to happen as soon as I walk out of this place. So he's probably sitting there wondering, will he ever leave Jerusalem? Will he ever make it out alive? Is he ever going to get to Rome? And this is the point at which Jesus shows up and assures him, and I think this must have been greatly encouraging. Jesus says to him, "Take courage." Just those words alone are incredible. "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Paul, you're not going to die here in Jerusalem. You're going to make it to Rome. And I just think this must have been incredibly encouraging to Paul. And this is where I think we need to pause and ask ourselves a couple of questions about the text. And that is, do the words of Jesus encourage us like this? I mean, I want you to think about it. So many things in life go wrong. I mean, am I right to say that? Things don't work out the way that we want to. Things get hard. People turn their backs on us. We lose jobs. We get accused of things that we didn't do. Our health begins to fail us. Sometimes our kids turn their backs on the faith, and we just don't know what's going on, and everything becomes very, very difficult. Sometimes we even begin to wonder if whether or not our faith is strong enough to help us get to the finish line. And my question is, when those moments happen, do we look to the words of Jesus to find encouragement? We might protest and say, well, it would be encouraging if he showed up to us and spoke audibly the way that he did to Paul, but that's not true at all. The words of Jesus are his words, whether they're spoken audibly or whether they're written down on paper. And I just want to ask, do we get encouragement when we read the words of Jesus? And especially when they go against our observations. If Paul is relying only on what his eyes can see, he's probably thinking, I'm going to die pretty soon. But then the words of Jesus come in, and they speak something contrary to his observations, and he begins to realize, no, I'm actually going to get out of this place, and I'm going to finish the course, and I'm going to be able to do it well. Now, I want to come back to that in the application, so I'm not going to labor that much here. But it seems to me that Jesus' words probably motivate Paul to act the way that he did in the following verses. We find him rescued from this plot, and we see the plot hatched in verses 12 to 15. Daylight comes, and some of them, about 40 of them, bind themselves by an oath. We're not going to eat, we're not going to drink till we've killed Paul. They go to a certain group within the council. Now, what's happened is there's a failed lynching. They haven't been able to convict him, so they got to come up with something else. So what we're going to do, we're going to trap him and we're going to murder him. So notice in verse 14, it says they went to the chief priests and the elders. Those two groups belong to the Sadducees. He doesn't mention the scribes, because the scribes belong to the Pharisees. And if this group had gone to the Pharisees, especially the ones who had declared Paul to be innocent, do you think they would have gone along with this plan to capture him and murder him? I don't think so. So they searched out the ones that they knew would agree to it, and they decide, we're going to kill Paul. But the plot's discovered. We read in verse 16 that the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Now it's interesting, we don't know anything else about Paul's nephew. We don't know anything else about his sister, and we have no idea how he came to get access to this group to find out what their plan was. It's very possible that Paul's brother-in-law was part of the Sanhedrin that wanted him dead. Could have been. Jesus tells us in the Gospels he's going to come and set brother against brother, mother against daughter, so on and so forth. So we don't know. But it's also possible that they just didn't keep the secret very well. You ever been part of a group of 40 people that was trying to do something secretive? Everybody going to keep their mouth shut? What's the saying? 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead or something like that. I don't know what the saying is. That's what it is. 40 people can't keep their mouth shut, so they probably just didn't keep it very well. It gets back to Paul. So he calls the centurion, asks him to take the young man to Claudius. He does, and he tells him what's going on. So Claudius tells him, well, keep your mouth shut. I got a plan, and I don't want anybody to interfere with it. And starting in verse 23 to the end of the chapter, we see this plot foiled. In verse 23, he called 2 of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at about 9 o'clock at night. Now, this is an incredibly large number. Based on the records that we have, this would have been about half of the Roman garrison stationed there in Jerusalem. And it raises the question, why in the world would they send half of the army to escort someone that they deem to be innocent? It seems like a lot, but it's not impossible. This was a pretty terrible situation, and I think they're afraid of what might happen. So they have to send a large enough unit to make sure Paul makes it out safely. By the time we get to verse 32, we realize that the spearmen actually turned back. So maybe they only marched as far as the city wall of Jerusalem. And once he's outside, then they turn back and go on home. So it's not actually that many that go all the way to Caesarea. And there's also something really weird about this text. In verse 23, when we read about these 200 spearmen, the problem with this is we have a ton of Greek literature from the ancient world, and this word appears nowhere else. We can't find it. So basically, we're guessing at what it means, and the Latin versions guessed that it meant spearmen. But it could also mean something like led horses, which would basically be that as they took off, they had some horses that carried their stuff. Or that maybe they would ride far enough and then they would have to switch, get on those horses and give the other ones a break or something like that. We simply don't know. But Luke tells us this is how many people took off, and so I'm going to take it at face value, and he takes him to this leader named Felix. Now, Felix is in charge where he is because 2 of the emperors really liked his brother. And can you imagine that if you are a very upstanding person and you work hard and you've built an incredible reputation for yourself, but you have got a brother who is an absolute idiot, but he gets hired because of your good name? That's Felix. He's a joke of a man. But he's in charge. And we have one of our ancient historians, Tacitus, who said that basically he exercised the power of a king with the mind of a slave. Whenever he achieved this particular status, he never rose above his base way of thinking. And when somebody who is not able to reason like a ruler gets in the position of a ruler, do you tend to have peace among the people? You tend not to. When somebody who's not qualified to lead gets the position of leadership, it tends to lead to chaos. And this is who Felix is. So we don't have high hopes for him. We actually find out in the next chapter he's willing to take a bribe if Paul will give it to him. But Claudius writes this letter. And I'm not going to read the letter for us in verses 26 to 30. It summarizes what's happened over the last 2 chapters, so I encourage you to do that. But I do want to point out some of the features of this letter. Now, if you go through it and you read it, you'll see the word I probably about 4 or 5 times. But in the Greek, there are 9 principal verbs in these verses, and all of them are in the first person singular. So he's bragging about himself. Very self-centered. But there's also 2 moves that he makes here that are very questionable. The first one is in verse 27. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. But the question is, when did he learn that he was a Roman citizen? When he was about to flog him. He makes it sound like, oh, I knew it all along. Because this makes him a hero. I recognized one of our own and I saved him. That's a lie. He also curiously fails to mention that he bound Paul and that he was planning to torture him. Just conveniently leaves those parts out because he doesn't want to tell on himself. So for the most part, he gives the truth about what's happening, but he's also very, very self-centered and he's trying to cover his own back. is what's going on. But he sends him on. Paul gets there to Caesarea. Felix gets the letter. He reads it. He asks Paul what province he's from. He learned he was from Cilicia. He's got a determined jurisdiction. Some also argue that it's not historically feasible because Felix would not have heard this case, but I don't think that we need to go that far. He determines jurisdiction, and he holds Paul until the accusers are going to come some 5 days later. And that's where we'll pick up, Lord willing, next time. But what I want to do is I want us to focus on the way we can apply this text to us this morning, and especially, again, as we consider verse 11. So I want us to think about where we are in the narrative of Paul's trials at this point. Paul has been, up to this point, and he still is physically unarmed. What weapons does he have at his disposal? He's not holding anything. Paul is also incredibly vulnerable, because what happens if the Roman authorities turn him over to the Jewish people? What's he going to do? He's probably going to die. What happens if the Roman authorities make a determination that he is guilty after all? Well, he's probably going to die. So he has no weapons. He's extremely vulnerable, and yet throughout the whole process, he displays a remarkable courage. And how can he do this? He can do it because he is convinced of his innocence, and he actually does have a couple of weapons with him. Paul is armed with truth and encouragement from Jesus. And it turns out that's all that he needs. Because just like Paul, we also don't fight with weapons of the flesh. If someone or a group calls people to arms, to take up weapons and go and physically fight other people in order to bring about what they perceive to be the ideals of the kingdom, if they are doing that, they are absolutely wrong. We don't fight like that. That's not who we are. We can read passages like Ephesians 6, taking on the whole armor of God. How many things is mentioned in those verses that are even offensive weapons? Only one, the sword of truth, and you know what that is? It's the scriptures. We don't fight with weapons like that. 2 Corinthians 10, we don't fight with weapons of the flesh. What we do is we tear down arguments. Every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. And so just like Paul, what we do is we fight with truth and we find encouragements in the words of Jesus. And what does Jesus say to us? Well, in this world, you'll have tribulation. But what has he done? He's overcome the world. He wins. It's not that he's going to win. He is going to win, but he's already won. And so how then would we apply this to ourselves here this morning? And I would say it's something like this. When Jesus says in verse 11, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Jesus is saying to Paul, you are going to get where I want you to go. You're going to get there. And nobody's going to stand in the way. What I desire for you is exactly what's going to come to pass. And church, I want you to know that that's true of us as well. We're going to get where the Lord wants us to go. It might be hard, and it might not happen how or when we would like. I just think about the Apostle Paul, even before he becomes a believer. If you had him sit down as a young man and say, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? What would you like your career path to look like? What kind of achievements would you like to have? When you retire, how much money would you like to have in your bank account? I would be willing to bet everything I am that he would not have predicted that what would happen to him is the way the book of Acts played out. But I guarantee you, if you could talk to him right now and you ask him, would he rather have it any other way? He would say, absolutely not. Because the Lord is merciful and he is gracious, and I'm so grateful for what's happened. And church, it may be that way for us. Life may be hard. I'm not going to promise you that you're going to have perfect health or you're going to have all the money that you want or that everything's going to break your way. That's probably not going to happen. I'm not going to promise you that life is going to work out the way that you want it to, and I'm not going to promise you that things are going to work out when you want it to. And you may wait for years and years before something comes to fruition that you just really, really wish would happen right now today. But I do want to encourage you with the words that Jesus says in John 14, verse 3. I'm going to go prepare a place for you. And if I do that, what am I going to do? I'm going to come back. I'm going to take you. You're going to be there with me. And so what we might not be able to say in terms of specifics between now and the end, as far as what our life is going to look like, here's what we know in the final analysis. When all is said and done, and when the sovereign will of God and his purposes are worked out to their complete fulfillment, what's going to happen for us is we are going to be right there with Jesus, and we're going to be there for all of eternity. And so, with all the trouble that Paul finds himself in and all the discouragement that he's facing, just know that Jesus has encouraged him with these words, I'm going to get you to where you want to go. And in John 14, he tells us he's going to get us where he wants us to go. And earlier in John's gospel, he has told us that he knows his sheep. He also holds us in his hand, and he says, no one is able to snatch them out. If you belong to the Lord Jesus Christ, the powers of hell can do everything that they want to do to try to take you away. But the Son of God has got you in his grip, and he not only will not let go, he cannot let go. You belong to him, and you belong to him forever. And so I would encourage you on the basis of this text, like Paul, fight the good fight, but do it the right way. Be prepared for whatever comes, but we need to trust that our Lord keeps his promises, and he will bring us into the kingdom. And it's at that time when he brings us into the kingdom that he promises us earlier in the Gospels is when he is going to drink of the vine new in the kingdom with us. And he tells us those words in the context of observation of the Lord's Supper. And so this morning, as we come to the conclusion in this service, we are going to observe the Lord's Supper as a celebration and an anticipation of the kingdom that is to come.